I must tell you that peace building is one of the things that, one of the areas that I've had some years of experience in at the United Nations, particularly with the Department of Peacekeeping at the UN. And some of the relationships with Africa has been very tangential, episodic. And we often wonder in terms of benefit added. But you're the experts here, and my job is just facilitate your presentation. And so we look forward to a wonderful, wonderful dialogue this evening. Of course, on Watch Democracy Grow, we're so thankful for this opportunity at such a wonderful venue at George Washington University, which is such a distinguished university here in the Washington, D.C. area. With that, let me introduce my first speaker, just to say that he is a representative of Amnesty International. Maybe we'll jump around if you'd like, or we will start from...
I think Dunya is from Amnesty.
Yes.
And she's not here.
Where is she?
Dunya. That's Dunya.
That's Dunya.
Yes.
She's from Amnesty.
Where's her?
But there's no card for her.
I'll move on to the end.
And do you not have mine on
No, that's
your list?
mine.
It's you.
You have that on your list?
No, I do not. Let's see. I made some. Miss Lorena Bright, who's a representative of human trafficking in sports, Mediterranean drowning, and Libyan immigrant. Thank you very much. The mic is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that my focus area is on child trafficking in sport. I may touch on the situation in Libya, but primarily my focus area is on sport trafficking. I'd first like to acknowledge my distinguished speakers on the panel that are present. It's an honor to be sharing this platform with you. I'd also like to thank Watch Democracy Grow and Mary for inviting me to share my thoughts on peace building in our communities and the challenges that young African dreamers face due to a lack of economic opportunities in their home countries. It's been well documented that the absence of peace and lack of economic opportunities makes young people desire to migrate from Africa, and in the process can get caught up in trafficking. With Africa's youth very keen in sport and their excellent performances in international competitions over the years, they have become target of human traffickers and unscrupulous agents who traffic them to economically stronger countries. My aim today is to bring to your attention a particular form of slavery, a modern form of slavery, which is child trafficking in sport. To begin with, I would like to say the obvious, which is that sport is a huge business. It's said to be worth an estimated $1.3 trillion, and that's the accounted for value. Most of you will not be surprised that 43% of that is accounted by association football, which in America is called soccer. The industry connects many different sectors and many activities, ranging from the bottles of water that are being sold in stadiums to the multi-million-dollar transfer fees and salaries that are paid by sport clubs, particularly in football, in basketball, and baseball. So what drives this economy? It's talent. Young talent, mostly from the global south, from Latin America, but more often than not, from sub-Saharan Africa. African countries have historically been high exporters of national players pursuing opportunities outside of their homeland. Children and their families dream of following in the footsteps of their great sporting icons such as Didier Drogba and Mohamed Salah, which are names that might be recognizable to African and Europeans, but maybe not so much in America. So the sporting success of such footballers has fueled the imagination of young boys, and those two, I must add, of opportunistic, unscrupulous recruitment agents who use the world of sports to make money by faking contracts to lure young players away from their home countries under illegal conditions, only to abandon them upon arrival. While the presence of professional African footballers is easily observed in Europe, it remains limited in Americas and Oceania, but it is increasing in Asia. But it's not only football that is affected. The same observation can be made in other continents and with other sports as well. So bringing it close to home, for decades, Cuban players have featured prominently in minor and major league soccer, major league baseball in America. But many had to negotiate with human traffickers and smugglers in order to get here. In basketball, there's the use and the abuse of the US F1 visa, student visa, to bring in players that compete in high school and NCAA competitions. Last year, the Evelyn Mack Academy, North Carolina, was shut down after a US federal judge indicted the founder of the same name after she eventually pled guilty to human trafficking. Mack had set up a private school in Charlotte, North Carolina, and private schools are not subject to the same restrictions as public schools with the F1 visa. And through this visa, she was able to bring in 75 foreign students, a lot of them from Africa, while promising them that they would be playing at prominent schools with scholarship offers. Instead, she would sell these athletes to public school recruiters and basketball coaches. Some reappeared in towns more than 100 miles away, and others went missing for months. Then, of course, there's a lesser-known sport of camel riding, where for years, children from the Maghreb, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, etc., and also from Pakistan and Bangladesh, as young as 7 and 8, were being sold as camel jockeys in Dubai and in the Middle East. Camel jockeys were often sexually and physically abused, most physically and mentally stunted, because they had to be starved, essentially, to be light enough to pilot the camels. These days, robots have replaced child jockeys, and this rule came about because the UAE signed a Palermo Protocol in 2009. Athletics, track and field, is another sport where there's a high risk of exploitation and trafficking. In East Africa, for example, countries such as Kenya and Ethiopia are the major source of the world's best long-distance runners. The success of those athletes has made them in demand, causing an exodus of such athletes to better economically countries to compete for them. So for example, at the 2014 Asian Games, 14 of the 22 individuals running events were actually won by athletes of African origin who had switched their nationalities either to Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, or Qatar. In December 2017, at the European Cross-Country Championships, 2 Kenyan-born athletes won male and female titles for Turkey. And so we can see how the demand for talent can lead to the exploitation of children who dream of a successful career in sport outside of their home country. I imagine that you may want to know what existing laws or policy responses have been put in place to deal with this phenomenon. Policy responses to the migration of young athletes have combined laws and regulations adopted by public authorities and sports stakeholders. But the crucial point here is that there are existing legal frameworks and sports regulations, but they're very easily circumventable by human traffickers. Because the reality is that human trafficking in sports is an economic activity. So yes, it's facilitated by criminals using loopholes in international regulations to build a strong economic model, but the sport industry does take benefit from the illicit movement of these children. One of the biggest challenges that I see is a lack of coordination of responses between the key stakeholders. At the same time, there's also a lack of prioritization from governments and sport governing bodies and organizations. And so at Mission 89, we have created a platform for coordination and have brought together these key actors. We have been successful in bringing together some of the stakeholders wishing to take action on this issue. Last year, to mark the European Anti-Trafficking Day, we organized a high-level panel session at the European Union, where for the very first time we had sports stakeholders join government agencies and civil society organizations. So we had FIFA, which is a football governing body. We had the International Athletics Federation. We also had the Council of Europe. We had the International Labour Organization, the Premier League, La Liga, and we also had ambassadors from various countries represented as well. So trafficking in sport is a complex problem which requires a multi-stakeholder approach to bring about a solution. But each stakeholder has a role and a set of responsibilities, and there's cooperation and coordination, then we can easily see the mitigation of this phenomenon. To begin with, sport governing bodies and clubs must ensure that children's rights rather than commercial imperatives are at the center of regulation, and that these regulations are in full compliance with international policies and standards. It can't be the other way around. I would also like to add that the media have a huge role to play in highlighting the exploitative practices that players encounter on their journeys to becoming the next Didier Drogba and to becoming the next Mohamed Salah or even Lionel Messi. But ultimately, it's governments with the greatest responsibility here. As duty bearers, they must ask more questions and demand more answers and accountability from sport organizations and structures operating within their borders. They must take action through legislative powers to protect their citizens from the unscrupulous individuals and elements promising fake dreams of success abroad. Through good governance and economic sustainability, governments, especially in Africa, can chart a new course which prioritizes the interest of youth in sport. But we can't do this alone as Mission 89. So I ask you today, as influencers and duty bearers here on this panel, to raise awareness of this particular issue, which is not much talked about in your particular agencies and organizations. And we're ready and able to support you in this regard. We've developed a set of tools, and we are in a position to build capacity. I don't know if, I'd like to show a short video which shows our outreach video campaign. Okay, well,
Thank you.
that brings me to an end.
Thank you.
Abruptly.
Indeed. Perhaps we'll have a chance maybe during dinner or what have you to sit. Our next speaker is Mr. Aneti Udofia, who's with Peace and Sustainable Community Development, based on the Greek philosophy of the three kinds of people. Interesting.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the honor of being on this august panel with some accomplished change agents that are doing great things on a global perspective. As a brief introduction to myself, as the moderator mentioned, my name is Anetia Udofia. I am here representing several efforts, generally around sustainable and community development work that we're doing. First and foremost, I am here representing the Uni of Ife Global Outreach. I'm the National Executive Director for a global effort meant to provide a catalyst to inspire possibilities, to tell the African stories ourselves, to recreate the greatness of our kingdoms. Also the advisory board chair of a UN-supported effort called AgroBiz. AgroBiz is in the business of turning small producers into big business with the training and the capacity building and the entrepreneurial development programs that we are rolling out across the continent. Also a chief executive officer of a power company, a microgrid implementation company called Grid Development Partners. I'm a managing director of Imperial EdTech, a education and technology solutions provider. And I also represent the Nikkei International Development Outreach. It is part of our effort to work with traditional rulers as opposed to government individuals for long-stake development activities. Today I would like to talk about a framework that we are working with. Is associated and actually started out of George Mason University and the National Defense College here in the DC area. The program is called Star Tides. It's sharing technology and research, transformative, innovative development for emergency support. Out of the Star Tides network is an international network of institutions who are dedicated to developing innovation and development, targeting specific communities. One of the development approaches coming out of the Star Tides program is the program that I'm going to be talking about today, which is how do you build community resilience? Resilience is defined as communities are under attack as it relates to natural and man-made and economic stresses. How do you prepare a community so that the community can survive the shock, but also come out better as a result of it? So building a community so that it recovers to a better place than when you started. So the Collaborative Community Resilience Framework promotes resilience in underserved communities by reducing risk and providing collaborative economic opportunities, such as peering and sharing approaches. The peering and sharing approaches that people are most familiar with would be the Ubers, the Lyfts, the Airbnbs, in terms of a shared economy approach. It seeks to turn threats into opportunities and reduce pressures for migration, radicalization, and marginalization of communities. In summary, economic disruptions, social stresses, and security breakdowns may lead to communities that have a need to migrate. For example, lack of water might lead a community to move, and we see examples of this in today's Africa when we're talking about in Nigeria, there's a herders and farmers issue, which normally you would say, well, put up fences and you eliminate the threat. But based on kind of the cultural norms, right, we now have security threats, right, that really are threatening the country in terms of people's need to migrate. Radicalization is, if left alone, especially within your youth population, if youth don't have any opportunities, any jobs, any businesses to start, they are left to be manipulated by forces that would have them get into evil things. And even in terms of the last speaker, even down to trying to find a better life for yourself and your family, right? What are you willing to do in terms of the radicalization and marginalization? Now, some of the future threats to our communities would involve things like job loss to technology, artificial intelligence, automation, cybersecurity, as well as the impacts of things like climate change, are also threats to these communities. So the strategy is to emphasize opportunities that can be found in these threats by focusing on communities to help them build resilience through these natural, man-made, and economic disasters. We do this really by improving a security and the productivity that aligns with the local cultures and can be sustained with local resources. The collaborative community resilience provides a framework to help stakeholders evaluate several platforms for innovation, technologies and other tools, and combines them into capabilities that meet community needs. Locally focused projects is the core of it. It's local demonstration that can lead to global replication. So locally focused projects integrate these capabilities with security, with governance, and institution building to make communities more productive through collaborative approaches while respecting their concepts of dignity, justice, and fairness. CCR integrates several technologies or platforms with collaborative economic models adapted to local settings And some of the examples of the platforms that are addressed is energy, including renewable energy and energy storage. As most people here on Africa's side, 70% of the population lives not connected to the grid or not being able to provide affordable power. So within that lies a tremendous opportunity at the local level to implement these collaborative approaches. For example, across much of the dark sub-Saharan Africa space, there is no need, and if there was a need, we'd probably do it, but you can't import sunlight. You can't really import wind. You can't import, in a lot of these communities, plenty of water, and in every community there's waste. These are all the feedstocks for what could be a renewable energy framework that could be delivered at the local level. So another of the platforms that is involved is health, nutrition, and integrated cooking. Again, if you identify a platform within a community that might have a specific health challenge or a health disparity, that is something that you can build local solutions around, leveraging the technology that's available. Another area in terms of a platform is shelter, heating and cooling and lighting. Again, if we look at what is currently being implemented across much of the African space, what you'll find is a lot of use of things like kerosene and very expensive options, generators for your power production. So how can we look at the natural environments, the crops that might be grown locally, the things that could be used from a waste to productive usage in terms of local elements. A fourth platform is the agriculture, including food security. Poverty alleviation is a big SDG, UN Sustainable Development Goal. And with the population increase across Africa, the projections of doubling in population in the next 25, 30 years, right? There becomes an opportunity that exists in terms of how do we feed people locally, but also how to recreate Africa as the breadbasket for the world. 60% of the arable land still exists on the African continent. With those types of opportunities, if we are to mechanize our farming, if we are to bring in technologies like precision agriculture that make farming more of a precise agribusiness approach, then there are certain things that can be done to advance communities in that level. One of the more exciting platforms is the information and communications technology. If you follow the pathway of how mobile has been developed on the African continent, you see kind of a framework or a case study of the opportunities that it would exist in Africa uniquely because we don't have the infrastructure concerns and the maintenance costs associated with it. So what is happening in the ICT space is literally the youth are driving a change where we're leapfrogging certain iterations of technology. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to leverage within that space. And then the last platform that really is focused on building innovative economics would be water, including sanitation and hygiene, which they call WASH. So this is an area of increasing importance relating to building resilience within communities at the base level. part of the challenge, and even here in America, when you have issues of Flint, Michigan, and other areas that are affected by bad water, then what you really have is a framework in terms of the value of clean drinking water and all of the things that it affects. It affects your health, it affects your ability for your agriculture and your produce to grow. So that really is the framework of the platforms that we're promoting. Now, the elements of community focus, knowledge sharing, innovative economics, platform integration, research and training, all of this provided a foundation for cross-cutting keys to success, an ability for us to go into communities and listen first, right? Learn from the communities before we implement lasting improvements to their community development models. I think from that approach, I think that's where I'll stop and we can answer questions later.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next task, international.
Okay,
Please join me in welcoming.
thank you. So, as Eric said, my name is Andrea Barron. I'm the Advocacy Program Manager from TASC, the Torture, Abolition, and Survivor Support Coalition. And we are located in Washington, D.C. We provide services to over 300 survivors of torture from all over the world. Over 90% are from Africa, mostly from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Cameroon. We also have survivors from many, many other African countries as well. I'm, as the Advocacy Program Manager, we work primarily on two different issues. One is human rights abuses in Africa, focusing on the country where our survivors have come from. So for that reason, we focus mostly on educating members of Congress and their staff about what's going on in Ethiopia, Cameroon, and Eritrea, but we've also worked on Rwanda, Uganda, Sudan, and other countries. Second, we're very concerned about the asylum process. Most of the survivors that we work with, we call them survivors of torture rather than victims of torture, are applying for asylum in the United States. They enter this country legally and they are afraid of going back to their country. They've already been tortured by repressive governments. So we're very interested in the issue of asylum and also very concerned about the hostility towards all immigrants, migrants, legal immigrants, undocumented immigrants from this administration. So what I want to talk about now is the issue of African migrants who are trying to get to the United States, who are being held up in Mexico, and who are being detained inside the United States. And recently we have had some of our survivors, and I will provide some quotes from one particular man from Cameroon he took a very long trip from Cameroon to the United States, and he was detained for 4 months in the United States. Let me back up a little bit to talk about why we see an increasing number of African migrants trying to get to the United States. Of course, the overwhelming majority are from Central America, and recently there has been an increase in Mexicans from the states in Mexico most affected by the drug wars. But we are seeing more and more Africans from Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Mauritania, Angola, Burundi, Niger, and Sudan. And there are several reasons why we see this. One is that more African migrants who are escaping political persecution, extreme poverty, don't want to go to Libya and take a risk of crossing the Mediterranean and possibly drowning. As you know, thousands of African migrants have tried to cross the Mediterranean. Some of them have gotten into Europe, many of them have drowned. Now they're being mistreated if they go to Libya, and then they might not even get into the European countries if they take the risk of crossing the Mediterranean. So for this reason, more of them are now trying to get into the United States. So those who can, they're taking a plane, and they're flying to a country like Ecuador or Bolivia, and then they're taking buses, walking all the way from the South America through Central American countries and into Mexico. So I'll share the story of one of task survivor, and I'll call him George. That's a pseudonym. We prefer not to reveal his real name. So he was detained. He decided to leave Cameroon for political reasons, for political persecution. He was from the Anglophone community. So about 20%, 15 to 20% of Cameroonians are Anglophone. Their primary language is English, and they are being marginalized, persecuted by the Francophone majority and by the dictator Paul Biya. So he was involved in activities related to the Anglophone community. He was targeted, and he decided to get on a plane. He was able to fly to Bolivia, and then he, as I said, he took buses and walked through Central America. Finally, he got to the United States, and then he was detained for 4 months in a detention center called Ote Mesa. So there's hundreds of these detention centers throughout the United States. This one happens to be in San Diego, in California. And he said he was shocked when this happened to him. And he said, and I quote, "I thought the United States stands for freedom and the rule of law. That is why I decided to seek protection here when my life was at risk in Cameroon." And so he had to wear an ankle bracelet for months. So these are they call them bracelets. They have to be charged 3 times a day. And it's a way for ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, to monitor their activities. And finally, a few days ago, he was able to get his ankle bracelet removed, and he said, "I feel like a free man now." And this was a really horrible experience for him and for other African migrants. So right now, I want to tell you a little bit what's happening now. The situation is getting even worse for African migrants and other migrants in Mexico because, as many of you know, the Trump administration is, in its hostility towards immigrants and migrants, is trying to force Mexico to crack down on people trying to get into the United States from Mexico, threatening them with crippling tariffs. So Mexico sent National Guard down to the border of the Mexican-Guatemala border. And in the past, like in the case with George, the survivor from Task, he received a transit visa to allow him to cross Mexico and then enter the United States, and he applied for asylum. But now what's happening is Mexico is trying to prevent these migrants, not only the African migrants, of course, the Central Americans as well, from crossing Mexico's southern border with Guatemala to go north and enter the United States and apply for asylum. So I just want to read something that just came out a day or two ago, a report, and the Central Americans who were not talking about being abused by the Mexicans. So as many people know, it's not only the United States where we see hostility toward immigrants, but this is happening in other countries. It's happening in Europe, it's happening in Africa, and now it's happening in Mexico, even though for so many years it was Mexicans who were being mistreated in the United States. So this is from, this report said, according to the Central Americans, they were being treated horrendously in Mexico, but they said African, Haitian, Garifuna, and other black migrants and asylum seekers were subject to greater discrimination, worse treatment, and extended detention. And so we're hearing mixed reports about the level of racism in Mexico. Some people said they didn't, for example, George, the survivor from Task, said he didn't experience any racism in Mexico, but we're reading other reports like the one that I'm talking about right now, And possibly this is getting worse now since Trump cracked down, is forcing Mexico to crack down on the migrants. So, and there was a caravan of Africans that were trying to come north, and they were being prevented from coming north and physically attacked by some of the police, National Guard in Mexico. So it's a really desperate situation. I want to conclude by just talking a little bit about what TASK is trying to do. We are trying to help some of the African migrants who are in detention in the United States. We communicate with people in these detention facilities, and we're trying to, some of us will become pen pals with these African migrants. We might send them books, Bibles, or other reading material. At some point, people can contribute small amounts of money for them to put in the commissary, which would enable them to buy extra food. So this is one small step that we are trying to take from our position to try to help them. And what made a huge impact on me, this was actually just yesterday, when I talked to George, the Cameroonian who was detained, and he received letters from pen pals when he was detained in Ote Mesa. And I said, why was that so important? You didn't, because we cannot provide free lawyers, TASK, and we can't provide housing. I said, why was that so important to have a pen pal relationship? And he said, because that connected us to people in the outside world and to show they care about us. And so we're going to hear soon from someone from Amnesty International. And as many of you know, Amnesty defends political prisoners all over the world. And often all they get is letters from Amnesty and its supporters. And this conversation yesterday had a huge impact on me, and it showed me that just connecting with outsiders who care about you and know you're there can make a real difference. So we're just getting started with this campaign now, which we're calling the African Migrant Solidarity Campaign. It's very complicated because every detention center has different rules. So I'm in contacts with 3 of them, and as we move forward with this, we're going to try to get more and more people involved, and also to make people more aware of what's happening in Mexico, and particularly to African migrants, to everybody, but because our survivors are from Africa and we are responding directly to them and their concerns. But it's important to have an awareness campaign. It's not only the administration, the Trump administration, it's hurting the interests of migrants all over the world. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. As was mentioned, our next speaker is from Amnesty International, Denia Tefeta. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Please correct me on this,
Okay,
on the pronunciation.
Okay, my name is Dunya Tagang, and I am an Almami Sila Fellow with Amnesty International. My supervisor, Adote Akawe, was not able to come today, and he actually asked me to pass his apologies for not coming today. But I will be trying to speak about what Amnesty is currently doing as far as migrant and refugee rights are concerned. We have a campaign that's particularly focused on protecting the rights of migrants and refugees, and this campaign has been ongoing for several years now, and currently given the different laws coming targeting migrants and refugees, the campaign is also more focused on those areas. And we also have a community sponsorship program for asylum seekers and migrants under Amnesty. We do different types of advocacy at Capitol Hill, including with senators and Congress people. We recently had a briefing on Venezuela, where we were actually advocating for the temporary protection status. We also do advocacy in different areas. For example, recently we were part of the 18 leaders that actually rallied in front of Capitol Hill to speak against the selling the immigrant and asylum seekers number that currently stood at 18,000, and our executive director Margaret has participated in this rally and was voicing her concern as far as this number is concerned. We think this number is very low, and we're trying to ask the US government to increase the number of asylum seekers to what it was before, which was about 95,000. This was one of the advocacy areas we actually recently undertaken. In addition to this, we were part of the coalition that works that monitored the homestead children's detention, and we have that report online, and I'm sure most of you can access the homestead report. In addition to this, we are working on protecting the rights of trans asylum seekers in the US. We recently actually freed and released a woman called Alejandra, who is a trans asylum seeker, and we had a briefing recently about the rights of asylum seekers who belong to the LGBTI community. We also support and advocate on the Global Refugee Compact, and we're trying to advocate with the US government to actually have a role and a responsibility in the Global Compact. As most of you may know, the US has not signed up for the Global Compact and what's indicated under the Global Compact. We also do a number of monitoring visits on the border. Currently, we are visiting detention centers in Miami and Texas and trying to see what issues are actually happening against African migrants and also migrants from the southern countries. In addition to this, we also recently have done a briefing on Venezuela, as I tried to mention, and this was more focused on the temporary protection status. We are currently also working on ending indefinite detention of children in different detention centers, and we have sent different advisory opinions in courts. As you know, there is this Remain in Mexico policy that's currently implemented, and we have been part of the coalition that's working towards changing this policy and this law. These are some of the things that we are working on. I might not be able to answer your questions because this is a sudden thing for me as well. You can also go to our website and find more information about what Amnesty is currently working towards immigrants and also asylum seekers. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker, Dr. Freeman, the mic is yours.
Good evening, Lawrence Freeman. I've been involved in economic policy development for 30 years in Africa, and I have a very active website, lawrencefreemanafricaintheworld.com. I was asked to speak by the organizer of this conference, Henrietta, on U.S. policy towards Africa. So I will keep my remarks brief, but I can tell you I wrote an article, I guess last year. It was called President Trump's Fundamentally Flawed Policy for Africa. You could find it on my website. And what I developed in that article is that we don't have really a positive policy for Africa in the United States. I'm sorry to say, as an American citizen. We don't have a policy that actually promotes growth and development in Africa. My travels throughout Africa over many decades to many countries indicates that the Africans would love to have the United States more involved and would love to see the United States invest in economic development in Africa. Unfortunately, we're not doing that. We don't have an approach to actually address the urgent need to eliminate poverty.
Of players that travel from Portugal, which is a lower league. I mean, they have Premier Leagues, but it's in terms of financial opportunity for players, you have players that migrate from Portugal, from France. They all want to go to the Premier League because that's where the most money is. So it's the same in Africa. I think people in general go where the opportunity rests. what needs to be done is to create an infrastructure, to create sustainable leagues that will allow the youth to stay for as long as possible, at least until they're 18, 19, and then take that decision, an empowered decision, to travel to Europe.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm always very happy to see the states and the cities involved in Africa. Many sister cities, which ring a bell with me when I'm traveling through those cities. And there's many states that are actively involved. Maryland has I believe, has an office of the governor that coordinates activity between Maryland and Africa. Of course, in Iowa, you have a very large community of Sudanese. Minnesota, you have a large community of Ethiopian, Somalians. So this is all very good. And a lot of trade trips are announced, and from Maryland, there's a lot of trips that go to Nigeria. The problem is that this cannot deal with the larger issue, as we discussed in a previous panel, when the moderator said that we need transformational policy. And the states that cannot do that. And the private sector cannot do that. The private sector has a very important role to play, but the private sector cannot generate the credit to maintain a large project that is several hundred million or billion over 10 to 15 years. I would like to see more transformational efforts in terms of changing the conditions, improving the conditions of life in Africa. I'm a firm believer that we can eliminate the suffering, but we have to deal with it from the top down. Governments have to put in big time to make these kinds of investments. And the states and the cities can do something, but my own view is I encourage them, but I don't think they have the resources to make the kind of change that's really required. So I don't know if that answered your question, Eric.
Hi, as I'm listening to you, Lawrence, I was increased population growth and just the total different kind of geopolitical dynamics that we face right now. And then for you, Larina, the human trafficking dimension almost situation, I'm just, as they say, I'm a law and economist, when you ban something, it becomes more lucrative. So you have to work on the people who are doing it, more so than relying on the national policies and also the so-called international community. There has to be some kind of effort to really educate the people. Well, beyond education, what else do we need besides the national policies on employment and looking at making sure that the international community come up with good policies to curb this? But it's very lucrative. So the people themselves there needs to be something beyond that. It's crazy.
Well, I mean, to answer your question, I think it's a calculated risk that they take. A lot of them have information, but you'll be surprised how many don't. And I think it comes from the mindset that pretty much all Africans have, which is that the grass is greener on the other side. It's not just the question of those in poor situations. You have middle classes, because human trafficking in sport also affects middle to upper class, and it's from a lack of information to a certain extent. I'll give you an example of my hairdresser in Switzerland. Her husband works for the United Nations. They're very well to do. She's looking after her sister's son. Her sister passed away. And her adopted son, is very educated. He's about to go to college, but he's also a footballer. And he was approached by some guy on the internet who said that he could get him a trial in England. Right? And so he was pushing and pushing my hairdresser to give him the $2,000 or $3,000 that it was. She then asked her husband to speak to him, to the so-called agent. And apparently, this man, who was supposedly in England, could not speak one line of English. Could not string together. So you're speaking about a so-called educated guy, who's about to be scammed, because of that dream of playing football. You know, and that's middle class, let alone those in, you know, in a really poor situation. So I do think that the element of awareness raising, which is what we do, we have a Not in Our Game campaign, and education is very important. You can save some, but you can't save all, because once, if somebody has it in mind that they're going to leave under any costs, they're going to leave. What we want to do is to educate those that, you know, are trying to make a decision and need more information, and those are the ones that I think can be helped. So, yes.
Go ahead.
I also want to add on what she was saying. I had a personal experience where, you know, someone who is actually working as a diplomat was involved in a trafficking case here in the US. This was a law office, a legal practice case, but this lady was mentioning that she was trafficked and that, you know, the diplomat who brought her to the US was actually knows this information, how she was, you know, this is a case in Middle East. And so the problem is, for instance, we have in African countries, government's daughter or children are actually involved in trafficking cases. And it's not simple, it's very complicated. And I have also seen this when I was in Ethiopia, where we had many women trafficked, you know, through different brokers who are working with agents in Middle East and other countries. So I think reaching out to this complex structure where we have a very clear accountability mechanism is still, I think, a work for all of us, maybe.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Please go
No, if you want to stay on the same topic, go ahead. I'll answer her question when you're done.
Yes, because I really liked what you added at the end there. Something that we are working on now is trying to create some checks and balances and mechanisms. So, for instance, we have found that the visa offices, they're in on this with the agents as well. You know, so what we would like to do is to create a situation, a model where there are checks and balances from the club level, you know, there are checks and balances from a law enforcement level, there's checks and balances from the sport federation and also from the Ministry of Youth. And so I think if we can assess these responsibilities, given that we know what the various mandates of these different agencies are, and create those checks and balances, that would close the loopholes that these agents are using. But without actually having all these different agencies working together in a coordinated manner, it just wouldn't work, because they're always one step ahead. So we do need, and it's not just sport trafficking, but I think in general, human trafficking, agencies need to work together in a coordinated manner with law enforcement. We're now going into a partnership with Interpol. We've just recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the IOM, the UN International Organization for Migration, and we would like to seek these partnerships, strategic partnerships, so that everybody is assessed, you know, is not only educated, but it plays a role in closing these loopholes. Yeah.
Fantastic. Dr. Freeman, just before you take the mic, just by way of protocol, I would like to acknowledge Ambassador Liberata Malumula. Thank you. Baragani, who was the former ambassador of Tanzania to the United States, and she's currently the associate director and visiting scholar at the Elliott School of International Affairs here at HW. Welcome. Dr. Freeman, the mic is yours.
Okay. On the question of the Marshall Plan, this would be a useful mechanism. The Marshall Plan was very much modeled off of Alexander Hamilton's National Bank. We gave Europe, this is one of the great success stories after World War II, we gave Europe maybe $12 billion total, of which would be hundreds of billions today. The money was used in France and England and I believe Italy to pay off some of their debt. In Germany, they did something very different. They created a development bank, and I'm forgetting the German name of it. They created a bank, so I think it was 1.4 billion out of the 12 was put in as capital stock in a bank, and then the bank could lend it out as credit. And that's what made it so successful. And that's actually the model. So what we could do it in the United States, or we could do it in conjunction with other countries, we could do it in conjunction with the China Silk Road, is we set up an international development bank. We put in money, we give it, so it's debt from the United States, no problem, or other countries. We put it into a fund, a capital fund, and then countries would borrow their money for long-term, low-interest credit for key infrastructure. We would not use it to pay debt. We would not use it to pay daily operating expenses. It would be totally dedicated for long-term credit and approved infrastructure programs that lead to the growth of the economies of the African countries. And such an international development bank would work. Money would be made from the projects, the debt would be paid back, returned to the capital stock, and this would then generate more of a base to lend out more money. It's a normal banking procedure. It says that you put restrictions on it. You can't trade in securities, can't invest in stock markets, can't buy and sell day trading, you can't pay debt. You would have restricted, dedicated, credit-based capital stock for one purpose, which is to promote economic growth. The French call this dirigism, directed credit.
Thank you, Dr. Furman. There's a question out of the audience, so if we can get the mic to our wonderful sister in the back. But as the mic is being made.
Well, we also talked to people in the Foreign Affairs Committee overall, and generally what we're trying to do now is to try to get the United States to reclaim its role as a leader on human rights. And there are an increasing number of Republicans who also believe that the United States should have that role. So I think that what you're mentioning, the key to do that, it's a little bit complicated, but the key is I think it's a good idea, what you're saying right now. I think the key is for us to build on the relationships that we have with some congressional offices, and they in turn work with different African countries, and one of them happens to be, I think one of them is Rwanda, I'm not quite sure. And so we would work through them. We would not directly approach the people in the African governments. It would be through the relations that we have in Congress. And that's actually what you're saying is a really good idea. Mm-hmm. So because of what you just said, as we continue our meetings, which we have on a regular basis, we can try to inquire which members have better connections with which particular African countries that are accepting refugees. So Rwanda is a very interesting case. While Rwanda is persecuting its own people who criticize the Kagame government, it is taking in refugees, trying to improve its public relations. And I've actually spoken, and I think Mary is aware of this. I've actually spoken on the phone to two Eritreans who lived in Israel for many years, and then they were given a quote-unquote choice. You either go to Rwanda or Uganda or go back to Eritrea. So, of course, it's not much of a choice. So one of them went to Uganda, which welcomed refugees, and the other went to Eritrea. The other one went to Rwanda, and neither of them wanted to stay in those countries. There were no opportunities for them. There was nothing for them to do. Once Rwanda finished telling the world, we are accepting refugees, they didn't give them any kind of opportunities. So both of them fled, made that long journey, and now are in detention in Livingston, Texas, in the United States.
Wow.
So thank you very much, though, because I will, start asking that question. It's a good idea. Thank you.
I think so as well. I don't know if many of you followed the displacement that took place in the Caribbean as a result of the hurricanes. But Guyana, through President David Granger, had offered anyone that was displaced as a result of the hurricane can relocate to Guyana. And with reason, Guyana is on track to introduce $2 billion of new oil money into the economy by 2020. And the population have actually gone backwards. And so there is around 750 million, they are projected to be around 1.2 million. So they're actively looking to actually increase. So I think the idea, and I think Amnesty International can play a major role in that because of, I think, their wingspan, they're spread throughout many different countries. But the idea of finding safe passage, I believe for displaced persons, I think is a very good idea. I don't know if anyone else wanted to touch on that, respond to that question.
Yeah, I think just kind of listening to the panelists with some good ideas and good suggestions, I think what we have to kind of go to is the root of migration. And it really starts in an area that a lot of us don't really pay attention to, but it's been ongoing for decades. That's the migration from the rural area into the urban community. That's really the start of how the trafficking kind of takes place, because it's generally done in the major cities or where the problems, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So it really goes back to the core issue. How do you keep these people in their own community, building their communities to a place where they don't want to leave their community? That's really at the core of what we're talking about. And then one of the things that I personally would say we need to really think about the things that we're introducing to African communities in particular. There's a very large diaspora population that is yet untapped in terms of the remittance dollars that are going back to these countries. And if we really take a look at implementing something like a Marshall Plan, we have to account for, 70, 75 years ago, we didn't have technology tools. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have computers. We don't have mobility. We don't have certain tools that are available for us, right, to rethink this idea of how do we develop Africa in the 21st century, not with 20th century ideas.
So on that note, let's just get a little exchange going, northwest, so to speak. I submit to you that Africa has all the wealth that it needs to develop itself.
Agreed.
I do not think Africa needs a Marshall Plan. I think what Africa needs to do is reorient its perception of wealth relative to its natural resources. With the deposits of gold, diamonds, and all the precious stones that we can think about to include oil, Africa can get, based on its known reserve, the front loading of funds, meaning that they can direct the World Bank to float bonds so that they can have the resources that they need right now, that they can build infrastructure and do a lot of things that they need. We need to get the IFIs, the IFIs, to work for Africa rather than Africa working for the IFIs. And I submit to you, it will take a reorientation of the governors of the banks, that means the ministers of finance, to really get into a better relationship with the IFIs. Because oftentimes, the IFIs are telling African countries what their country's strategy should be, rather than the African countries telling the World Bank what their African strategy is and how they fit into it. So I really think a new group of thinkers, like the young lady I saw there, Ms. Joyce Williams, to me, how come you're not on someone's think tank discussing what are some of the new approaches for African development? The same thing with Dr. Valentine over here. I mean, she's worked many years in some of the international financial institutions, and our good friend, of course, Dr. Bland back there, Mrs. Bland. So I honestly believe, because this is the same way that the World Malaria Fund was funded. All it was based on pledges. They front-loaded based on pledges. Not one dime had to leave the treasury of any one country. So to me, those are the types of discussions that we really need to talk about. How do we disrupt the processes where we reorient and we utilize the resources of Africa to work for itself? Yes, sorry.
Just as the discussion about is Africa ready for democracy, right? We have to also take a look at the traditional mechanisms and have they really worked for Africa and African interests as opposed to global interests. So you mentioned the World Bank, and I'm not here to castigate any organization, but a lot of the times the debt is structured in a way that the African countries can do nothing but fail in terms of the repayment of that debt. So you're absolutely correct that within the resources that are native to the continent, right? And how do we get greater value out of these resources? A perfect example is Nigeria. Long before crude oil was ever discovered in that country, Nigeria had a favorable exchange rate to the US dollar. It was more valuable, but that was based on the strength of agriculture, cocoa, palm, right? These staples. And what happened is a good case study for these new countries that are having these finds and minerals, right? The extraction of these resources outside of the country, and then to be resold, refined crude oil, right? In the form of petroleum, where a country that has, for the longest time, the #1 exporter of crude oil actually ends up buying refined oil at an elevated price. And the communities that it was extracted from environmentally are degraded. They no longer can fish, they no longer can grow the produce, right? The housing values are sunken because of flared gas and the damage to your property, the damage to the health. The mortality rate is still under 50 years of age.
So take a pause there. There are some best practices out there. The case of Angola, for example. Angola has been able to exact a better relationship with regard to its oil exploration. It has maintained a majority share, and it has mandated certain requirements around disaster mitigation type stuff. And they have insisted that every contract that the international community gets must be done through a joint partnership with a local entity. We just have to manage our resources properly. So I agree. There's opportunity, there's risk, and it's a lot to do with leadership.
I agree. And in lack of the right leadership in place, right? How many times do you do the same thing, right? And expect a different result? It is clear to me that our leaderships, in terms of politicians, their outlook is short-term, right? And it is, I'm in office for 4 years, maybe 8 years. If I then transfer my governorship to a senatorship, then I can stretch it to 16 years.
So guys, fast track it. Don't be shy, jump in if you need to. But let me just extend it to something, and it's really to Dr. Freeman. I recently traveled to Kenya over the summer, and you talked about the new rail from Nairobi to Mombasa. While it was a wonderful thing in terms of infrastructure, people could actually travel the commerce more. What it didn't do is really make it more accessible to locals. So for example, you go in from Mombasa all the way, you go through Savo and Maasai area, but there's not one stop within the Maasai area. They did not necessarily get the benefit, but they get the cost. But the other thing that spoke to the ethos of the people was that the conductors of the trains were Chinese. Those who were collecting tickets were Kenyans. And so it's something happens inside that goes to the core when you see those types of things reminiscent of what we went through in the 60s. Development has to be smart growth, and it has to be culturally competent. What says you to that?
Well, first of all, I've seen pictures, videos of trained Kenyan women and men running the train.
They're not running the train.
I'm talking now. Yes, they are running the train. I've seen them running the train. And I've seen the change. And first of all, there's no equation of what is going on with China now and what went on in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Africa when it was run by the West. The West didn't build infrastructure. It did not build infrastructure. China is building infrastructure. There's all kinds of improvements. In fact, that train now has to go into its next phase because the train from the Mombasa to Nairobi is going to continue to go east and can become the eastern leg of an east-west railroad, which should have been built 100 years ago, or at least 50 years ago, which will revolutionize trade and development. The point is not that Africans have to take orders from anybody. Why should they? They're sovereign nations. And the World Bank and the IMF, in my view, have played a horrible role since the liberation and the winds of change in the 1960s took place in Africa. I'm not suggesting that any bank should run policy for Africa. I'm saying that we create a new institution, something like, and it doesn't have to be this, an international development bank, which will not be run by Lagarde or Wolfenson or any of these bankers. I don't trust these bankers to do anything right. Look how they're destroying the U.S. economy. So the fact of the matter is, I'm not interested in a bankers-run dictatorship. I'm interested in sovereign nations working together, committed to their shared common interest, which is development of their people. Development that raises the standard of living. And by raising the standard of living, we can improve the educational, cultural, and spiritual value. You cannot talk about democracy or education if mothers are worrying the next day about where they're going to get food for their children. If you're living in a house that doesn't have electricity, if you have 4 kids or 5 kids crammed into a room.
Dr. Freeman, this is the rapid fire part.
To have democracy, you need to have leisure time. To have leisure time means you have to have the material standard of living met every day so you can have leisure time. And that requires this type of economic growth. And it's what African countries should jointly decide. The OAU never reached this level, and the AU hasn't reached this level.
Thank you.
But they should.
If I can interject there. I think you mentioned the International Development Bank and that the leadership would comprise of governments. Sovereign nations that are made up of governments. But I'm thinking that if these institutions are already compromised by the IMFs and by the World Banks, then isn't that going to be cyclical somehow? I mean,
No, you set up a new institution.
yes, but there are existing structures in place that have existing commitments.
The existing structure is dominated by bankers and the debt. I forget that debt and their agreements and work on a whole new set of relations with sovereign nations.
I think the elephant in the room,
So this is rapid fire.
is that China is writing checks without a whole lot of preconditions for a lot of African countries. So as we try and set up, a new development bank, even as the U.S. tries to recover with the new programs from OPIC to try and make U.S. companies more competitive, the reality still exists in a lot of African countries that train has left the station already.
Agreed.
And that the U.S., because of years of not really having an Africa strategy, which I agree with you, now is playing catch up, and who knows if they're going to be able to catch up, quite honestly.
It did. Okay. Go ahead.
I had a question for Ms. Bright.
Join Mr. Van as part of that working group, either as co-chair, and we get some young thinkers to really work on it, because I think it's a question that's been out there, and we know the mechanism, the machination of it, in terms of whether it be a national sovereign fund, the whole idea of collateralizing assets, and even some of the Bitcoin aspect. But this is different, because this is based on something that is real, right? And countries can do it. So I think coming out of this, we have some brilliant minds in the room, and that's where it all begins. We also have some very distinguished panelists. So guys, I think if we want to work on doing something different, at the end of the day, that our kids can come back and say, what did you do? I think this is one small project that we can work on and put out a white paper on maybe and develop something.
Many, many times in history, and we can do it again, no problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.